Welcome, everyone. My name is Howard Louth, and I'm director of the Center for Austrian Studies here at the University of Minnesota, and we're delighted to invite you and to welcome you to our noontime webinar. This webinar is an event that is co-sponsored between the Center for Austrian Studies and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. The Center for Austrian Studies has had a very long and profitable collaboration with the Center with CHGS, and we're pleased to be able to work together once more to look back at a very sort of sad but important chapter of the Central European past and its broader implications. Without any further ado, let me turn things over right now to my colleague and fellow director, Alejandro Barr of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Alejandro.
Thank you, Howard, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce our guest today, Sara Brenneis. And before I do that, I also want to thank all the units that have made possible this event. Howard Louth is the director of Center for Austrian Studies, then the Department of Spanish and Portuguese is also a co-sponsor of this event. The Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University. The Center for Inter-American Studies of the University of Graz in Austria, and Centro Sefarat Israel in Madrid. So this is a truly global event that spans from the west coast of the United States to Graz in Austria. So as Howard mentioned, this is it's a sad topic that we are covering here. At the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, our topics are not the most uplifting generally. Still, we thought this is an important topic for different reasons. It's a little known aspect, or I would say it's not, here in Holocaust education and in Holocaust history, it's a minor theme, the role of Spain during World War II and the Holocaust, and it's also surrounded to this day with a lot of political controversy. Was Spain a savior, a bystander, or a perpetrator? And Sara Brenneis' book that she will present today will illuminate some of these aspects from the perspective more of culture, literature, because she will analyze Spanish representations of the Nazi concentration camp Mauthausen in novels, in historical texts, in films, memoirs, and new media from the mid-40s until the present. And I would also like to present another important book that Sara Brenneis and Gina Herrmann published this year. The book on Mauthausen is from 2017, but this co-edited volume titled Spain, the Second World War and the Holocaust, History and Representation, which is possibly the most comprehensive volume on the subject that has been published until this day, with 36 contributions of scholars from different disciplines. Sara Brenneis is a professor of Spanish, European Studies, Film and Media Studies at Amherst College, and she is currently also the chair of the Spanish department. Sara, it's a true pleasure, and we're honored to have you today at this event, at this virtual event, and we very much look forward to your presentation and to this discussion afterwards. Thank you all for attending, and I will now pass it on to Sara.
Thank you so much, Alejandro, for the invitation. I'm so happy to be joining with you. Also wanted to thank the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota for their virtual hospitality, and certainly to everyone tuning in all over the world and all over the country. I want to start with asking you to imagine this scenario. There's a coup in your country. Quasi-fascist military leaders rise up against a democratically elected government. The coup plunges your country into a war between those who remain loyal to the democracy and the followers of the quasi-fascists. You're fighting a superior military strength aided by foreign autocratic leaders who tip the scales. They win the war. Their leader, a general, becomes the dictator. Because you oppose the coup, you are now at risk. You could be imprisoned or shot as a member of the opposition. You have to flee your country. You cross the border in an effort to save your life, but you're not welcomed on the other side. You're put into a camp, a detention facility. In this new country where you're now a refugee, another fascist leader is rapidly gaining ground. You volunteer to fight again, defending what you believe to be its right, but soon your new country falls to the fascists and you fall with it. You've fled your home country, so you're stateless and you can't return. You're sent to another detention facility, this one even worse than the first one. It's a camp where you're used as slave labor, fed almost nothing, brutally punished, and left to die. If you're one of the few lucky ones and you survive the long years in the camp, you think about returning home, but you'd still be in danger. So you're considered a dissident, a political activist, you're considered the enemy, and you'd still be imprisoned or shot if you went back. You're an immigrant in your new country, refused benefits, cast aside, particularly because so many others have suffered so much more. So what happens next? How will anyone back home ever know your story? How will they understand what you've been through, the sacrifices you've made, the horrors that you've seen? And will you ever go back? So this scenario may sound familiar, but it may remind you of what's going on in the world today, but it's not a contemporary story. This is what thousands of Spanish people experienced during World War II after fighting in the Spanish Civil War against the Franco regime and then fleeing to France. When France fell to the Nazis, they could not return to Spain. They were considered stateless. They were considered enemy combatants, and they weren't repatriated. Among all of these hundreds of thousands of refugees, thousands were deported to Nazi concentration camps as political prisoners. These Spaniards have fought against fascism not once, but twice, and the majority died at the hands of the Nazis. Their stories are only really just becoming known. I started off my talk today by stripping away some of the identifying details about what happened to the Spaniards deported to Nazi concentration camps, because their stories, as brutal and seemingly impossible as they may appear, are not all that different from what has happened to the refugees, political activists, and others seeking asylum outside their own war-torn countries around the world at moments across history, including today. When I began working on my book on the Spaniards in the Mauthausen Nazi concentration camp, the most common reaction I heard, and really what I still hear, is there were Spaniards in Nazi concentration camps. This year, 2020, marks the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, as we know, and still many people inside Spain know next to nothing about what their countrymen and women went through in the Nazi camps. They don't even know that they were imprisoned in camps. Outside of Spain, even scholars who study the Holocaust are often unaware that Spaniards were among the prisoner population in the camps. Why have these Spaniards been forgotten? Why, given that World War II and the Holocaust are among the most widely studied events in human history, has the story of the Spaniards in the camp been left out of the narrative? And why is it crucial at this point in our collective history to allow them to regain their voice? So let's start with some background context. Historians estimate that between 8,700 and 15,000 Spaniards were deported to Nazi concentration camps across the Third Reich. We don't have precise numbers, in part because the Nazis feverishly destroyed the camp records during the waning days of the war to try to hide the evidence of their crimes. The Spaniards, as I mentioned, were political prisoners in the camps. They were not Jewish. They were imprisoned because they had fought against Francisco Franco, who was one of Hitler's allies, and then they had fought against Hitler in France. And it bears mentioning that Spain was neutral or non-belligerent in World War II, really in name only. So Spaniards were sent to Nazi concentration camps throughout the Third Reich: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Flossenburg, Ravensbrück, Neuengamme, Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Mauthausen. the majority of the Spaniards were deported to Mauthausen, a granite fortress in the upper Danube region of Austria, about 25 kilometers to the west of Linz, and its system of 60 subcamps spread out across the country. Of a conservative estimate of about 9,000 Spaniards deported to the camps, about 7,200 ended up in Mauthausen. Only 23% of these people, about 2,200, survived. The greatest number of Spaniards died in Gusen, which was really the deadliest camp in the Mauthausen system and was just a few kilometers away from the main camp. You can see that in the bottom picture here, although the Mauthausen has been essentially preserved as a memorial site, the Gusen camp has been more or less absorbed into the landscape. The top photo is of the main entry gate to Gusen, which is now a private chalet. And I will mention that the Polish government has made recent efforts to try to acquire the land around Gusen to be able to maintain the former Gusen camp as a memorial site as well. So the bottom line here is that the Spaniards, the majority of the Spaniards deported to Nazi camps went to Mauthausen, and the majority who were sent to Mauthausen or Gusen died there. The Spanish prisoners were not subject to the policy of extermination that the Jews suffered. They were not killed for biological or ethnic reasons. They were not sent to gas chambers en masse as part of the Nazis' final solution. Instead, they were used as slave labor and died of different causes, all of which were directly attributable to their treatment by the Nazis. They were in Mauthausen, in Gusen, and other subcamps. They died of disease, starvation, exhaustion, and extreme temperatures. But they were also shot, beaten, gassed, thrown off the high cliff that ringed the camp's quarry, and also electrocuted on the high voltage fences around the camp. Other Spaniards did survive, and many of the Spanish survivors had been selected to work in an office, a kitchen, a photo lab, or even the SS car garages where they worked as a mechanic, or some other interior space. So in these more privileged positions, a minority of the Spanish prisoners received slightly better rations. They were out of the elements, and they were spared some of the backbreaking labor that the other prisoners suffered in the main camp quarry or in other details. And so these prisoners were able to survive until Mauthausen was liberated by American forces in 1945. So I want to return to this question about why Holocaust scholars often do not recognize that Spaniards were among the victims of the Holocaust, among the victims of the Nazis, better said. One Spanish survivor, José de Diosamil, put this conundrum quite plainly in his memoir, and I'm going to read the Spanish, but you have the English translation right below it. Sobre el holocausto nazi hay un sinfín de libros que describen la persecución del mundo hebreo, pero se ha escrito muy poco, y gran parte del mundo lo ignora, sobre los millones de personas no judías que también perecieron en los campos de concentración. Por parte de todos los estados, a excepción de Israel, ha habido un deseo por silenciar o minimizar la realidad de esos 6 millones de seres que también fueron exterminados, tanto como los judíos. Although Diosamil cites 6 million, today really the accepted figure of non-Jewish victims of the Nazis is closer to 5 million. As a survivor, Diosamil has a personal stake in the fact that at the time he published the memoir in 1995, very little had been written inside Spain about the Spaniards in the camps. Diosamil also uses the word exterminados, but this is imprecise. Although they were killed in the camps, the Spaniards were not slated for extermination as a group. Moreover, of the 6 million Jewish and 5 million non-Jewish victims, the Spaniards died in exponentially smaller numbers. The estimates of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 Spaniards who died throughout the concentration camps pale in comparison to either of these numbers. But there are Holocaust scholars who study other relatively small groups of non-Jewish victims. For instance, about 7,000 homosexuals were killed by the Nazis, a number which is more or less commensurate with the number of Spaniards who were killed. There are a number of historical studies of this victim group, including in scholarly overviews of the Holocaust, whereas Spaniards really are roundly excluded or mentioned only in passing in these texts. So the historian Doris Bergen has written about one productive way to approach the relationship between Jewish and non-Jewish victims of the Nazis that doesn't diminish the singularity of the Holocaust. And this is from her book, War and Genocide. I'll quote a little bit here. There is no doubt that hatred of Jews constituted the center of Nazi ideology. Jews were the main target of Nazi genocide. At the same time, Nazi Germany persecuted, incarcerated, massacred, worked to death, and deliberately starved millions of people. A little further on, whether or not one considers members of any or all of these groups to belong under the label victims of the Holocaust, their fates were entwined in significant ways with that of the Jews targeted and murdered in the Nazi quest for race and space. And specifically when Bergen writes about the populations of disabled and Roma, she says that these programs shared with the genocide of the Jews personnel, methods of killing, and goals of so-called racial purification. So Bergen's point that the same violent methods were used against Jews and Gentiles, the same Nazi officers and Nazi officials murdered Jewish and non-Jewish people, and that similar policies of purification, her word, were applied to victim groups that weren't Jewish, including political adversaries, is instructive. If we're to understand the breadth of what happened during World War II in the Nazi camps, no stone should be left unturned. So we return to the question, why have the Spaniards been excluded? The answer really has to do with Spain itself and the way that the country has approached the story of the Spaniards in Nazi concentration camps since the end of World War II. There's a short answer and a long answer, so I'm going to start with the short one. The Spaniards who were deported, imprisoned, and killed in Nazi concentration camps have been mostly forgotten by scholars, historians, the government, and the general public in Spain. If they've been ignored in Spain, how can we expect them to be remembered outside of Spain? How would Holocaust scholars who don't read Spanish or Catalan even find their stories? And if the Spanish government has never officially recognized its role in the deportation, and if the only national memorial to the Spaniards who died in the camps, which was inaugurated only earlier this year, is tucked away in the inner courtyard of a government building in Madrid, why would any other country step in to remember them? That's the short answer, but there's more to this story. The Spaniards in Mauthausen were not silent. They took and saved photographs and documentation of the camp while they were still inside. They wrote memoirs and novels about their experiences. They were interviewed for documentary films. They formed veterans organizations and constructed memorials to their countrymen and women who died in the camps. And every year, until the pandemic forced them to go virtual this year, the survival groups take busloads of Spanish high school students to Austria to see the camp memorial and learn about the Holocaust. So the Spanish survivors of Mauthausen didn't just sit back and fall into oblivion. They have been actively telling and retelling their stories for over 75 years. It turns out that the question is not whether the survivors have told their stories, it's who's listening. So now I'd like to show you some examples of the different ways that the Spanish Mauthausen survivors have captured and transmitted their memories of the camp over the course of their lifetimes. We'll talk about the impact these have had on how the history of the Spaniards in the camp has been remembered or forgotten, particularly in Spain. And we'll meet some of the extraordinary individuals who comprise the small but mighty contingent of people who have devoted their lives to making sure that the legacy of the Spanish victims and survivors of Mauthausen lives on. One of those individuals was Juan Romero, the last Spanish Mauthausen survivor. Romero died in France over the weekend at 101. With his death, we have entered a new era in which the survivors themselves are all gone. These two yellowing documents are the work and the words of Joan de Diego and Casimir Clement, two men who risked their lives to save written evidence of the fates of their countrymen and women who lived and died in Mauthausen. I'll mention that the majority of the Mauthausen prisoners were men, but a few female prisoners, including a few Spanish women, were transferred to the camp toward the end of the war. De Diego and Clement entered Mauthausen in 1940 and were put to work in the quarry, along with most of the Spaniards deported to the camp that year. They both knew some German from their time in the prisoner of war camps, and after months of punishing labor in the quarry, they managed to secure assignments in the Mauthausen administrative offices, working as clerks for the Nazis. Now, because they were fluent in Spanish and Catalan, they were tasked with organizing lists of the incoming Spanish prisoners, as well as those who had died in the camp. They risked their lives to save records and keep duplicates with additional details such as the prisoner's hometown and birth date that would help family members identify their loved ones after the war. The image you see on the left is the first page of the list of the dead that Juan de Diego was tasked with keeping. Amazingly, he kept this registry from being incinerated in the Nazi pyres toward the end of the war, because he handed it over to a member of the International Red Cross when the camp was liberated. Clement also worked in secret to save prisoner documents, as well as a file of SS identification cards and photos. This complex operation was dangerous and life-threatening. As a result of his position inside the Mauthausen offices, Clement was one of the first concentration camp prisoners to testify to the conditions in the camp and the Nazis' crimes. On the right, you see the first page of Clement's sworn testimony for the Cohen report for the US government, which he gave on May 9th, 1945, just 4 days after Mauthausen was liberated, about what he witnessed. This legal testimony, which I have here in the English translation, includes a mention down here of prisoners killed in rooms full of poison gas. This, of course, is evidence of the existence of gas chambers in Mauthausen, something that has been called into question by Holocaust deniers, and positions Clement as one of many Spaniards who were direct witnesses to the Holocaust. It's really impossible to overstate the importance of De Diego and Clement's record keeping and testimony. Most of the Nazis' meticulous documentation were irrevocably damaged or destroyed, and millions, obviously, who could bear witness to the Holocaust were killed. So these records were not only evidence of the Nazis' crimes, but would also years later help Spaniards begin to understand what had happened in Mauthausen, identify the people who had died there, and begin to see the camp not as a vaguely threatening place that existed only in individual memory, but as an actual killing field that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Jews and Spaniards alike. Francesc Boix was just a teenager from Barcelona interested in photography when he fought and shot pictures at the front during the Spanish Civil War. He was 20 when he arrived, like so many of his countrymen who were implicated in the Spanish Civil War at Mauthausen. By all accounts, a good-humored young man and something of a prankster, Boix finagled an assignment in the identification service in the camp, where 2 other Spaniards were already working. So Boix and the 2 other Spaniards developed copies of the photographs taken by official SS photographers in the camp. These would have been SS identification photographs, pictures of visiting Nazi dignitaries, photos of the daily operations of the camp, and that also included images of prisoners who had been electrocuted, tortured, or otherwise brutalized in Mauthausen. Boix and his compatriots began developing additional copies of the negatives and hiding them. Eventually, this operation involved other young Spanish prisoners who worked outside of the camp on a labor detail, and they smuggled the duplicate negatives with them. They passed these materials then on to an Austrian woman who lived in the town of Mauthausen, and was friendly with the resistance, and she hid them behind a rock in her garden wall. So although I'm describing this operation very succinctly, it risked the lives of every single person involved, from Boix to the boys who smuggled the negatives out of the camp, to any other prisoner who was aware of what was going on. When Mauthausen was liberated in 1945 and the negatives could be recovered from their hiding place, no one in Spain saw them. Boix was one of many who could not return home. So he took the photos around Europe, he published them in communist magazines in France, and he used them as evidence against the Nazis at the Nuremberg trials. He was the only Spaniard to testify at the Nuremberg trials. So of the hundreds of maybe thousands, here are a couple of the photos that Boix saved. In this photo, we can see Spanish prisoners building the camp. And we know that they're Spanish because we can see up close in the detail of this photograph, the inverted triangle with the S insignia for stateless that the Spaniards wore on their uniforms. You can see that I also have a bandana that's a commemorative bandana with the same insignia. And they're building the walls near the main Mauthausen gate in this photograph that Beuys was able to save. This is a contact sheet of a visit by Nazi High Command Heinrich Himmler to the camp. Himmler visited Mauthausen twice in 1941. And you can see in this detail, you can see Himmler's face quite clearly in this photograph. This would have been one of the photos that Beuys was able to take to Nuremberg that essentially proved that the Nazis were well aware and indeed planned the concentration camp system, as Himmler was there in Mauthausen himself. Once the camp was liberated, Beuys was able to avail himself of one of the Nazis' Leica cameras and could take photos himself, including this iconic shot of some of the Spanish survivors gathered in front of the gates of Mauthausen. And I was able to use this photograph as the cover of my book. After many years in which Francesc Beuys was totally unknown in Spain, he died at the age of 31 in 1951. He was very young. He has now become something of a folk hero in Spain, inspiring this film, The Photographer of Mauthausen, which came out in 2014 and which you can stream on Netflix. We now understand the implications of what Beuys and others in the photo lab did. A large intact body of photographic documentation of Mauthausen, more than has survived from any other Nazi concentration camp, was saved. It's now in the hands of the Mauthausen Veterans Group, the Amical de Mauthausen in Barcelona, and it's cataloged at the Historical Museum there. Between the end of World War II and Francisco Franco's death in 1975, the dictator was fully in control of the press and publishing industries. There was also this pervasive myth that Spain had remained fully neutral in World War II. So these two factors really doomed the majority of the Spanish survivors of Mauthausen to silence. Most of them remained in exile in France, trying to restart their lives. While Holocaust survivors in other countries began to publish their memories and the post-war trials of Nazis began, Spain stood on the sidelines. But there are a few exceptions to this rule, two of which I'd like to share with you today. The first is an incredible series of articles published in the Spanish press in 1946 by a Mauthausen survivor by the name of Carlos Rodriguez del Risco. In April and May of 1946, Rodriguez del Risco published 35 installments of his series Yo he estado en Mauthausen, I was in Mauthausen, in the Francoist newspaper Arriba. These articles describe in great detail the Mauthausen camp installations, the labor details, the punishments meted out by the SS, the convoys of Dutch Jews and Russian POWs who were gassed upon entry, and specifics, including specific names of Spaniards who were in the camp. They also absolve Hitler of any guilt or knowledge about the Nazis' crimes and glorify Franco as the savior of Spain. This is the very first concentration camp narrative to be published in Spain, and it has never been republished or translated. So in fact, earlier this year, with the help of a Spanish historian, I tracked down Rodriguez del Risco's daughter, Luisa, who never knew that her father had published this story, and incredibly had never been contacted by anyone about her father. It was very emotional for her to be able to read her father's words. And it's really an incredible story that he tells. In terms of historical detail, it rivals the earliest accounts of the Holocaust by more well-known figures such as Primo Levi. But it's also an incredibly complicated narrative. It's anti-Semitic and contentious, and it appeared in the regime-controlled fascist newspaper. But these articles mean that we can't categorically say that Spaniards would have had no knowledge of what had happened to their countrymen and women in the concentration camps after the war. And it may be obvious by now that this is the project I'm working on now, an edition and translation of this incredibly important text. Another publication came out in Spain while Franco was still alive that describes the experiences of the Spaniards in Mauthausen in stark terms. The author, Joaquim Amat Piniella, was a Catalan intellectual who survived Mauthausen and was able to return to Spain soon after the end of the war. He started working on this book the same year as Rodriguez del Risco published his serialized articles, but he couldn't get it published in Spain until 1963 because of the censors. So the main difference between the newspaper articles and Amat Piniella's account was that Que el Reich was a novel that never actually identifies Mauthausen by name, but it's clearly based on Mauthausen. It's written by a Mauthausen survivor, and it's, to my mind, one of the most balanced and poetic accounts ever really written by a Spanish Mauthausen survivor. And Marta Marin Domine and Robert Finley published a very careful English translation of this book in 2014, which I highly recommend. By the 1960s and 70s, as Franco's stranglehold on the press and publishing industries began to lift somewhat, some information about the Spaniards in Mauthausen began to trickle out. The catalyst for how Spaniards finally began to grapple with their own history and the fact that there were in fact Spanish nationals who had been deported to Nazi camps, and that Franco and his ministers were ultimately responsible for their suffering and their deaths, was Montserrat Roig. A young journalist and novelist from Barcelona, Roig sought out Catalan survivors of the Nazis in the early 1970s to interview them. She had to travel to France because most of them had not returned to Spain. Franco was still alive and they were all still at risk. But through years of interviews and personal relationships with these survivors, Roig was able to write a groundbreaking work of history, a testimonial account of the Spaniards who had survived Nazi concentration camps. She focused on Catalan survivors, but these accounts applied really to most of the Spanish Mauthausen prisoners. Roig published Els Catalans als Camps Nazis in 1977 in Catalan, 2 years after Franco's death, and it came out in Spanish translation the next year. Roig essentially broke this story in Spain. Catalans in Nazi camps includes interviews with some of the people we've just met, Casimir Climent, Joan de Diego, who is the gentleman here in the video with Roig in this interview, and Joaquim Amat Piniella. The book included photos from the trove that Francesc Boix saved, published in Spain for the first time. And in an appendix at the very end, Roig includes the lists that Climent and de Diego had amassed of the personal details of the Spaniards who had died in Mauthausen. Roig's book was nothing short of a revelation in Spain. Many people in Spain learned about this history directly from her work. So keep in mind, this is now 30 years after the fact. But as with all revelations, its time in the spotlight was far too brief. And after a few years, when there was a flurry of interest in the Spaniards in Mauthausen, they were interviewed on Spanish television, as you can see here in this video. They were profiled in magazines. There were pulp histories with lurid details of their imprisonment. Their memory did fade into the background, essentially outmatched by Spain's transition to democracy. And still, the survivors themselves had not had their moment and had not had any kind of reckoning with the Spanish government in its role in their deportation. And they had not told their stories necessarily on their own terms. And they hadn't had the kind of media or scholarly attention that they watched Holocaust survivors get in Europe throughout the 80s and the 90s. So beginning in the mid-1990s, after a decade of media silence on the subject, the survivors themselves began to publish their own stories. José de Diosamil, the person I quoted at the beginning of this talk, was the first in 1995 when he wrote La Verdad sobre Mauthausen, The Truth About Mauthausen. By the early 2000s, 2 or 3 survivors were publishing their memoirs every year, such that by 2012, there are at least a dozen of these books in circulation. And they all have a few things in common. They tell a personal story of each survivor's experience in Mauthausen with minute details that only a witness could recount, such as the dismal malt coffee that they had to drink in the camp, the weight of those granite stones that they had to carry in the quarry, the acrid smell of the crematory smoke that permeated the camp. They're also all very idiosyncratic. They're written by people who aren't professional writers, who were motivated by an urgency to recount what had happened to them and also what had happened to those who died, whose voices could never be heard. And they're stark, honest accounts. They're written in Spanish or Catalan. They were published by small regional presses. And despite the number of books published, which I've tried to illustrate in this array, they've had very little impact outside a small circle of readers inside Spain who have been able to find them. And none of them have been translated into English. So again, we're faced with the reality that the Spanish Mauthausen survivors have been trying to tell their story all along, but they have had, in many ways, they've been overshadowed by the countries grappling with the Spanish Civil War and dictatorship. This is contradictory because the Spanish deportista Mauthausen are an essential part of Spain's history of conflict during the 20th century. And at a time now when the country is fully democratic, when there are no longer tangible risks to exposing how the Spaniards in Mauthausen got there and what happened to them, it's nevertheless difficult to crack open this history and to look at the painful details, the complicity of the Spanish government, and how the Spanish public has ignored the stories that have hidden in plain sight for decades. I want to close with one last example of how the Spanish memory of Mauthausen is operating in Spain today. And it's an example that I think speaks to some of the complicated issues having to do with memory that I've been trying to address in this talk. So in 2015, to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Mauthausen, a Madrid-based journalist struck on a new way of remembering the Spaniards who suffered in Mauthausen. And it was a Twitter account from beyond the grave. Antonio Hernandez, the journalist's uncle, survived Mauthausen, but died many years later in 1992. He was resurrected in 2015 as the voice of this Twitter account, Deportado 4443, the number he was assigned in Mauthausen, in which his nephew compiled Hernandez's scattered writings, but also added quite a bit of additional material, links, videos, photos, drawings, and so on. Hernandez never wrote his memoirs, and certainly he couldn't have kept a diary inside the concentration camp. But deportee number 4443 keeps a daily log, 140 characters long, over the course of 3 months, which represents the 5 years that Antonio Hernandez was imprisoned in Mauthausen. The Twitter account is startlingly effective at telescoping years of anguish into these short missives and uses the tools of social media, likes, hashtags, retweets, in a way that actualizes the story of one Spaniard in the camp and by extension of all the Spaniards in Mauthausen for a new generation. But on the other hand, deportee 4443 can also be seen as dehistoricizing what actually happened to these Spaniards, who lived, of course, in a pre-digital age that prevented them from making the kinds of connections and assumptions that a digital Antonio Hernandez can make. I'll give you 2 examples of this. The first is this tweet that commemorated the end of the war, in which Hernandez writes, "Durante casi 5 años los alemanes nos han llamado Rotspanner. Hoy será el último día en que tengamos que llevar ese nombre y ese uniforme," which is essentially over the course of 5 years, the Germans have called us Rotspanner. Today, this will be the last day that we have to wear this name and this uniform. So having a full sense of the experience and a perspective like this to sort of reflect back on the name the Germans called them, and that this would be the end of an era for those Spanish prisoners, is a somewhat anachronistic way of being able to reflect that a Spanish prisoner probably would not have had in the moment. And then another example here is the way that this Twitter account engages with contemporary news sources, contemporary people, including me, because at the time I started looking into this account and studying it, I was presenting on it at conferences, and so the Antonio Hernandez of 1945 retweets the Sara Brenneis of 2015, which is certainly another anachronistic interaction. But this Twitter account, I think, at once makes the story and experiences of the Spaniards in Mauthausen immeasurably more accessible to a wider and younger audience, while at the same time divorcing it from the historical reality of World War II and the concentration camps. Ultimately, whether this is a stroke of genius or that will help keep the memory of Spaniards in concentration camps alive, or a trivialization of their experiences, really lays in the beholder. I started this talk asking all of us to imagine what it would have been like to have walked in the shoes of the Spaniards who were exiled from their homeland and ended up deported to a Nazi concentration camp. And I want to conclude by emphasizing why understanding and remembering this history is important. And so I just want to read the very last paragraph of my book to understand that. Only now, as the last Spanish survivors of the camp are disappearing, has Mauthausen claimed a stake in Spain's cultural capital. Mauthausen's symbolic power will no doubt continue its transformation in the decades to come as the landscape of Spain's collective memory continues to shift. Whether Mauthausen will become a flashpoint for Spain's quest to recover aspects of its historical memory lost to the passage of time and the repression of dictatorship as the Spanish Civil War has become remains to be seen. Nevertheless, the Spanish experience of Mauthausen has expanded from the memories of its 2,000 or so survivors to capture the attention of a growing segment of the population. Mauthausen will cease to exist as a concentration camp as firsthand memories of it are lost. But as an imagined space, the camp will become more visible as Spaniards continue to encounter its diverse representations. The Spaniards who lived and died in Mauthausen deserve to be remembered in perpetuity. Their victimization is the tangible evidence of Spain's dark allegiance with the Nazis. Their driving will to fight against fascism and survive in the face of evil is their legacy. They are, now and forever, part of the history of the Second World War and the Nazi genocide. Thank you so much. And I am happy at this point to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Sara, for such a rich and insightful presentation. I will collect some questions that there have been a couple of questions on the chat, and please feel free to pose them now as well if anyone has additional questions. So there's some questions of more of historical specificity. Maybe you want to address them. One is where the majority of victims at Mauthausen from Catalonia. Another question is related, well, it's a question about the international brigades. It's a bit, it's less directly connected to your talk, but it's a question about records of members of the international brigades and where one could find such records. I mean, of those of the international brigades during the Civil War that joined the fight from United States, England, and Wales. So maybe you want to start with those questions, and then we'll continue.
Sure, I'll see what I can do. The question about the number of Catalan survivors, I think the numbers, or the Catalan victims, that is to say. So it's influenced by the numbers of refugees, essentially, who were fleeing Spain at the end of the war. And of course, the war, the last front was Barcelona. So there were a lot of Catalans who fled north. And it sort of goes from there. I don't think by numbers that Catalans were actually the majority of the Spaniards in the camp. There was a large contingent of Catalans. In terms of the people who wrote about their experiences and reflected on it in memoirs and films and in testimony, and in particularly because Montserrat Roig began with this testimonial book that focused on Catalans, it ends up that we know more and we have more representation from the Catalan contingent of survivors in the Mauthausen camp. But there were certainly Spaniards from Andalusia, from really every province, every region of Spain. Were represented, including the Canary Islands in Mauthausen. It's simply that more of the representation has been written in Catalan and perhaps by Catalan survivors. And the other question about the international brigades, I'm not sure I can respond thoroughly to this question, because I mean, in terms of my research, the International Brigade volunteers there were a lot of them present in Mauthausen. There isn't a sort of separate archive of IB volunteer material that I was at least able to find. But one of the issues that stands out with International Brigade Volunteers was it was one of the ways that the Spaniards in the Mauthausen camp were able to organize into sort of a clandestine resistance contingent, in part because they knew volunteers who had also ended up in Mauthausen from other countries, and it was a way to connect with, in particular in communist circles, it was a way to connect with other prisoners in Mauthausen who were from different countries via, their previous presence fighting for the Republic in Spain in the Civil War.
There's a question, Sarah. There's several very interesting questions. There's one I would like to pose first, as it might lead to, since it's an interesting theme in terms of grappling with memory of Francoism in Spain more broadly. And it's the following: how do the histories and memories of Mauthausen survivors intersect with Jewish life and Jewish memory in Spain today?
I mean, I think the fact that one of the sponsors of this talk is the Centro Sefarad Israel means that in today's Spain, it has been a movement to try to connect these two survivor stories, and we can actually draw back some lines that connected them in the 40s, because as Spanish refugees were fleeing Spain and ending up in concentration camps, Jewish refugees were fleeing Europe, passing through Spain. That story is very complicated, not what I'm going to get into right now. But in the minds, especially of, I would say in Spain's public discourse right now, there have been connections that are made, at least in people's minds, about the fact that Spanish Republicans deported to concentration camps had contact, very limited, because the Jews, as I said at the outset of my talk, were really essentially eliminated very quickly after entering Mauthausen. But there was some limited contact, enough that we can refer to the Spanish survivors of Mauthausen as witnesses to the Holocaust in many cases. And that effort to understand in a productive way the Mauthausen survivors as witnesses to the Holocaust, albeit not victims, strictly speaking, of the Holocaust, I think is a way that discussion has been more fruitful in Spain in terms of connecting the victimization of Jews in the Holocaust and the experiences of Spanish Mauthausen survivors and Spanish Republicans.
Can I ask a brief follow-up question on that subject? Since 2005, there is this official commemoration of the Holocaust in Spain, and the Amical Mauthausen has been invited to light a candle and initially also to give a talk during that commemoration. And do you see also tensions and conflicts happening in this? Only today, maybe you've seen it, Triángulo Azul, which is one organization representing Mauthausen survivors, said they don't feel sufficiently acknowledged in those commemorations. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely can. There are still a lot of unresolved tensions not only among survivor groups. So I mentioned Amical de Mauthausen, but Alejandro just mentioned another, Triángulo Blau. There are other survivor groups, Mauthausen survivor groups in Spain. And there's not only tension among these different survivor groups, then there's also family members that are not formally part of this survivor groups. For instance, there's a group of family members who have been working on the Stolperstein project in Spain, who have also felt somewhat isolated or marginalized from other commemorative events that the Spanish government has been working on, or that the Memorial Democràtic in Catalunya has been working on. There are tensions, and you mentioned the Day of Remembrance. Again, this brings up these definitions in Spain of what is the Holocaust, and were Spanish Mauthausen survivors victims of the Holocaust, or were they victims of Nazi violence? And things have gotten muddled in Spain to the extent that there is some jockeying from survivor groups to be more involved in the Day of Holocaust remembrance, and then there's some resistance from understandably, from other groups saying, well, these are two different, we have to understand these as two separate, equally, they're victimization, but one is the Holocaust and one is Nazi violence against Spanish Republicans. So I would say there's both the ongoing tension among the survivor groups, and there is certainly still tension among Jewish groups and these Mauthausen survivor groups in Spain. That's ongoing.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me ask you a number of questions, very interesting questions on the chat. One is, how important were intersectionalities? Individuals who fought on the left and who were Jewish, who were from Spain? That's one question. Let me ask another one. Did you face any resistance to telling this story in the course of your work? And then there's a very interesting question regarding your findings about Spanish women who were deported to Mauthausen.
Yeah, so I'll start with the resistance. I think that's an interesting question, and I have been asked that before. It's really, for my work, I have encountered actually the opposite. That being said, I've found a lot of support from survivor groups. They've been very welcoming. Other historians that work on this issue, survivor family members as well. A very welcoming community that is very eager to have this story told in a more visible way and to more international audiences. They want to get the word out for all the reasons that I talked about in the talk, all the ways that the Spanish survivors and victims of Mauthausen have been made invisible over the years in Spain, over the decades. But with a caveat that I have not worked directly with the Spanish government, for instance. I have not done survivor interviews. That's no longer possible as the survivors are all gone at this stage. Someone in the chat mentioned what I mentioned earlier, that the last Spanish survivor died over the weekend. But in terms of resistance, I've found very little. I think it's a productive dialogue. What my work has really resulted in, just talking about these questions in a more open and thoughtful way in discourse in Spain and outside of Spain, I think has in general been productive. And then the question about Spanish women. So it's interesting. There's a couple of different threads here, and one is that the numbers aren't exactly precise, but there were very few Spanish women who ended up in Mauthausen. They were transferred from Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was the camp where was a women's camp, and there were many more Spanish women. My colleague Gina Herrmann has studied them and is still studying that group of Spanish women in Ravensbrück, where the conditions were similar in terms of slave labor, but also distinct in terms of sexual violence and gendered violence that they faced in Ravensbrück. The Spanish women that ended up in Mauthausen were transferred in 1944, and there's different estimates between 5 and 7 Spanish women ended up in Mauthausen. Their stories are fascinating. These individuals, one of them was married to another Spaniard who was in Mauthausen, and so husband and wife were reunited in the camp. But it's just another testament to the fact that there are hundreds of these stories, of these individual stories that haven't really been told. There's a lot out there to people who are interested in delving more deeply into this topic. And I would say the Spanish women in Mauthausen is one of those topics that's not as tapped.
Thank you, Sarah. There are a number of questions that address issues of cultural production, popular culture. One is, how historically accurate is the film, The Photographer of Mauthausen? And then another question is, do you know any other Spanish camp experiences that are finding their way into popular or mass culture?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are two great questions. I really appreciate the question about The Photographer of Mauthausen, the film, which, as I mentioned, is available on Netflix. I recommend the film in part because I think it gives a very visually accurate depiction of Mauthausen. The production team worked very closely, went to the camp, and worked with Benito Bermejo, who is a preeminent Spanish historian of the deportation. And yet there are a number of glaring factual errors in this film, and they were integrated in the film to make it more dramatic, clearly. And the one that sticks out the most is a hand-to-hand, fight between Francesc Boix, who I mentioned in the talk, or the character that plays Francesc Boix, and the main Nazi photography official working in the photography lab. They come to blows, and in reality, that kind of confrontation would have simply ended with Boix's death. He would have been shot on sight, and in the film, it's sort of glorified into being a reckoning between, the reckoning that I imagine most concentration camp prisoners would have wanted to have, but was impossible, would have been completely life-threatening. There are a number of other counterfactual elements in the film. Most of them just sort of collapse all heroism on top of Francesc Boix, who was very heroic, but was not the only hero in the Mauthausen concentration camp. And in terms of other cultural representations, they're proliferating. I'm trying to keep up, but some of the newer ones that are starting to come out and have been coming out in the last couple of years are some graphic novels about Mauthausen that are fascinating. One of them is actually a graphic novel called the El Fotógrafo de Mauthausen. The Mauthausen photographer was part of the inspiration for the film as well. And again, there's a sense that they are a way of reaching new audiences through the format of the graphic novel, which, as those of us who teach know, can be a way of really showing students, as in particular, how stories unfold in a way that's so visually enticing. But at the same time, they suffer from the same issues as the film, which is to say that there are counterfactual elements in some of these new representations that may have a deleterious effect, may really have a harming effect on how we actually understand the history behind the Spaniards in the camp, by, again, glorifying certain individuals as heroes or showing a form of resistance that would have been absolutely impossible, or even in the case of the Twitter account. And there are other Twitter accounts, by the way, now. That's also another way of sort of watching these stories unfold that also bring a lot of reflection to the story of the Spaniards in Mauthausen that might not be as accurate in terms of how the survivors themselves remembered their experiences. Oh, Alejandro, you're on mute.
We have another question. We have only a few more minutes, but I would like to pose one question from our colleague Sandra Alfers at the Ray Wolpo Institute at Western Washington University. She asked, in your research, have you come across Spanish language or Catalan poetry written by Spanish prisoners in Mauthausen?
So I have come across a very small sample. There is one book by the author I mentioned, Joaquim Amat Piniella. He did publish a book of poetry later, quite a bit later, I think in the 60s or the 70s, if I'm not mistaken. It's in Catalan. I'm not sure if it may have been translated to Spanish. I'm not sure if it's been translated into, I'm almost positive it hasn't been translated into English. But in terms of poetry written closer to the time, or either in the concentration camp or published soon after, I actually haven't found any poetry. That was a genre that I didn't end up including in the book, precisely because I didn't find much evidence of Spanish poetry. There are a lot of other things that the prisoners did in the camps, including drawings, maps, other graphic representations that they were able to do in the camp, but poetry either did not survive or was not not a method that they grappled with their experiences to a large extent.
If it's okay to go a few minutes over one, Sarah, we have two more questions here. One is, can you interpret or translate for us what wrote Spaniard? So I read Spaniard.
Rot-Spaniard, it's Spanish red, and it's interpreted because the derogatory phrase that both Franco and the Nazis used to describe the Spaniards was Spanish red, because they made the equivalency that they were all communists. Franco was notoriously anti-communist. That was part of the schism in the Spanish Civil War, and so they were known as Rot-Spaniard, as Spanish Reds in the camps. Just the demarcation to lump them all together. It's worth noting that they were not all communists. There were a lot of different political parties represented, and people who were apolitical, who had simply gotten swept up in opposition to the Franco regime for one reason or another. But there were a lot of different political parties, and they were also an anarchist presence in the camp. So it was a fairly imprecise nickname, but one that really stuck, and that at this point has been kind of sort of taken by the survivor families, and in some of these representations as a badge of honor. It is actually sometimes used now as sort of a way of identifying, much like the blue triangle, a way of identifying the anti-fascist nature of the prisoners who were in Mauthausen as a badge of honor.
Maybe these two last questions can serve as a sort of closing reflection, Sara, which is where are we heading to? What do these materials serve in terms of memory? The witnesses are dying. The Spanish survivor there barely anyone. It's not clear if the last survivor passed away, because it's not clear if it actually was a survivor. There's some debates around that. But the fact is that there's a dwindling survivor population. And maybe you can say something about what does it mean for Spain, and where is Spain heading with its current political problems and memories. Memory problem continues to be an important aspect of controversies, of political debates, and very stark divisions. So what will memory of survivors of Mauthausen, what will this memory look like? And as Isabel asked in the last question in the chat, what would be a good way for Spanish institutions to address this issue, to honor the memory of those who've passed away in Mauthausen?
It's a great question, and between the lingering infighting and different controversies over whose memory is this sort of who's been more victimized, or whose memory is worth more. I think for me the most valuable way that we could move this memory forward would actually be to integrate it more into the Spanish curriculum for high school students. For college students. It's shocking at how little the Spanish public, and particularly new generations, know about this history. What they learn tends to be from movies. Until 2018, when this Voice movie came out, there was no feature film about the Spaniards in Mauthausen. There's such a rich source of novels, memoirs, poetry, film, all kinds of things that would be really excellent for using in secondary education in Spain. And I think that's where you have to combat forgetting, is through teenagers and 20-somethings for whom this memory is completely out of grasp right now, unless they encounter it in the classroom in ways that allow them to open that door to see how Spain's history is interconnected with the history of the rest of Europe, of 20th century Europe. And then the connections they come fast and furiously after that. Once you start to understand that these deportees were refugees in France, how they were treated, they were anti-fascists, you start to make connections about what's happening in the world today that I think are only productive in seeing how important remembering these individuals and their legacy is, and how informative it can be for how we approach the world and how our future world leaders approach the world going forward.
Well, thank you so much again, Sara, for joining us this afternoon, this evening in Spain, and in Austria. And I want to thank also everyone who joined us, who attended the webinar, also for posing excellent questions. And we hope to continue these conversations and others on related subjects. I want to mention that on the 22nd of October, we have another talk that deals with Spanish memoria histórica, with Spanish historical memory debates, with a filmmaker. We will show a film and discuss the film Santa Cruz, por ejemplo, Santa Cruz, for example, by Gunther Schweiger. And this is an opportunity to continue conversations about Spain's memory problem. This is on October 22nd. You can check it on the website. We will add it right to now. Maybe Joe can do it to the website, the link. If not, I will do it in a second if you wait 1 second. But in closing, thank you again, Sara, Brenneis, for being with us, and we look forward to having you again on a future occasion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alejandro. Thanks to everyone who came and asked questions. Thank you.